Now, it's a great pleasure to be here, and the talk I'm going to give the title is here. It's a paper which is going to be published by Hope, History of Political Economy, I think in June. We just got the proofs and the copy edited version. And of course, this is a paper many of you might have difficulties to relate to, because who was Sraffa? And then in the late 1920s, who cares? We are so much more advanced today. Our understanding has so considerably improved. Why care about the dead ideas of dead people? That is an attitude towards the history of our subject and maybe even other subjects, which is quite widespread. Only what is modern, what is being produced now matters, all the rest is just garbage. Now, my attempt will be, or our attempt, because it's a joint paper by Neri, Rodolfo, and me, will be to show that this is not the case, that you can learn quite a bit by reading old authors. I mean, not the age matters, by the way, but the quality of what they had to say. And in the case of Sraffa, he had a lot to say, and he was such an intelligent person that I'm always again and again surprised by his contributions, looking at his hitherto unpublished works. Now, Piero Sraffa and Counterfactuals is the topic, and clearly enough, you think it works now? Yeah. The paper is structured as follows. After an introduction, I will talk briefly about Sraffa's intellectual journey and the Sraffa archive in Cambridge. I will then talk about Amartya Sen on Sraffa, because he wrote a number of articles on Sraffa and Counterfactuals, the methodological foundations of production of commodities by means of commodities. Then I will talk about Sraffa's reconstruction of the theoretical domains of value theory in classical political economy on the one hand, and in Marshallian economics on the other. But keep in mind, it was Sraffa at a time when he was a young man, trying to find out what economics was all about, what the different traditions meant, and whether they had something in common, what were the differences and all that. And of course, it was a process which was very much in travail, very much in development. It was not so that he was born and then he pronounced his statements. No, I mean, he was developing, trying to understand this very complex situation at the time. And so we shall see that to some extent. Then theoretical problems related to what he called price fixing, that is essentially Marshallian economics, demand and supply. I mean, how are these magnitudes, prices, but also quantities determined? And what are the forces Marshall brought into play? Then on the role of counterfactuals in the theory of value, counterfactuals reasoning and general competitive analysis, counterfactual reasoning and the problem of capital, because Sraffa's criticism of marginalism, of the neoclassical theory, has quite a bit to do with his, inimity as regards the use of counterfactuals in that theory as a part and parcel of the theory itself. You're aware of that when you come across concepts such as marginal productivity and marginal utility. And then concluding remarks, if there's time. I have a tendency, as was really shown yesterday, to extend the time limit I'm given. So please be aware of that. Okay. Oh, wrong. So now, this is the motto of the thing. Scholars not infrequently assume that one aspect of the past can be changed in everything else, and everything else kept constant. Surgical counterfactuals are no more realistic than surgical airstrikes. Causes are interdependent and have important interaction effects. Even minimal rewrites of history may alter the context in such a way as to render the consequent moot or to undercut the chain of events or logic leading to it. And we shall see, in a sense, this is what Sraffa does for economics, or certain parts of economics which are available at the time, marginalism in particular. Now, Amartya Sen, in a number of articles, here I give you just the years, has variously discussed the methodological foundations of Sraffa's approach. And his focus in his papers was indeed on counterfactual reasoning, that is, what if questions. If things are different from what they actually are, what would happen? Can we say something really reliable in this regard? Can we know what alternative worlds would look like if we changed some of the premises of the world today? That is the question. How much can we say? And this is the main issue. And of course, that's the main issue of the social sciences, you could say, in a sense. All our techniques, econometric, statistical, whatnot, uh, are typically trying to answer such questions. In economic policy, I mean, if I want to have a higher rate of employment, what has to be done? I mean, the what if question is, and so on and so forth. You're clear. So, but this concept of counterfactual, according to Sen, does hardly make an appearance in Sraffa. This is true and it is not true, as we shall see. Sraffa was not opposed to counterfactual reasoning, but he was opposed to certain forms of counterfactual reasoning, as we shall see. And indeed, Sen did not maintain that he was entirely opposed to it, but I think in a sense, in some of his formulations, this could perhaps be interpreted as if he was, and some of the interpreters of Sen argued that way. They argued that in Sraffa there is no counterfactual, there are only observational statements, but it has nothing to do with counterfactuals. Now, Sraffa does not use the concept of counterfactual. That was not a term which was already en vogue at the time when he lived. But you see, very often, I mean, one and the same concepts across time comes up, but using different words. And indeed, I think you can argue that Sraffa had the concept, but not the term. And of course, this is an old issue. David Hume, in his contributions, not only to economics, but in general, persistently asked that question. What if? And what if, of course, is a question of all people who want to improve the conditions in which mankind lives. I mean, what if we are not constrained by certain institutions? What if income distribution and wealth distribution would be different? What if the institutional setting would be changed? These are all, so to speak, experimentations, speculations into a future which is uncertain, which we do not know, but where we believe upon theories we have got can be analyzed and understood. Now, the concept of counterfactuals in philosophy, as I am told, became popular only after Lewis, 1973. It was around, it was discussed, but its popularity started fairly late. And in a nutshell, what I'm going to argue, I mean, we are going to argue. Sorry, when I say it's because I'm the speaker, but it's, of course, a paper of 3 people, and this must not be forgotten. In a nutshell, this is now a comment on philosophy. Intense discussion over 40 years has cast doubt on the adequacy of any simple analysis of singular causation in terms of counterfactuals. The emphasis ought to be on simple analysis of singular causation, one factor really driving the story. And what can be said, I think, and maybe you agree with us, Sraffa in the late 1920s anticipated this in economics. So he anticipated a result, if you want to call it that way, in philosophy, which came a great deal later. Now, contents of his respective work. I mean, first of all, what Sraffa tried to do is he tried to reconstruct the development of the theory of value from Petty to Marshall and all the others to modernity. He wanted to understand what happened. What was the path by means of which people arrived at particular ideas that became prominent, etc., etc. That is one very important thing. And how do they differ from one another, and why? How come that certain ideas of the classicals fell into oblivion, whereas other ideas, which are perhaps not even competitive, became so prominent. I mean, there is an explanation needed. He had no categorical objection to the use of counterfactuals. His criticism of Marshall's supply curve was not based on a criticism of counterfactual reasoning, but of partial equilibrium and ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus means everything else constant apart from that one singular force that is changed. And he argued this cannot be sustained in general, and he produced interesting arguments in support of his view. His criticism followed partly, not entirely, but partly from confronting the partial equilibrium approach with a general equilibrium approach in the tradition of Vilfredo Pareto. Yesterday, when Neri gave his talk, we already spoke about Sraffa's knowledge of Paretian general equilibrium theory, and he indeed used it to some extent, and of course also in other respects distanced himself from Pareto. So the question is, on the one hand, the method of simultaneous equations, which he found very useful and indeed indispensable in discussing the kind of problems he was confronted with. And on the other hand, the substance of the argument. What are really the forces, if you wish, determining relative prices, income distribution, and so on and so forth? And then, of course, the kind of counterfactuals marginalist theory invokes regarding the quantity of capital in given supply and its marginal product cannot be rendered meaningful except in the uninteresting case of a one commodity model. I mean, the theory is based, so to speak, on foundations which are not strong enough to carry the edifice, the entire edifice which is built upon it. Now, Sraffa's intellectual journey, very briefly. Essentially 3 periods, and we are talking only about the first periods, 1927 to 31. That was the starting point when he showed then his equations to Pigou and in particular also to Keynes. Then 40, more correctly, maybe 42, there were only a few slips at the beginning of the 40s, 42 to 46. Of course, the work was interrupted by the Ricardo edition. He was appointed to the edition of Ricardo's works and correspondence by the Royal Economic Society, and therefore stopped his creative work on his book, Il mio libro, he called it at the beginning of the first period. And then he was stopped again because of the correspondence James Mill and Ricardo was found, and he had to completely reorganize the Ricardo edition. And then he finished it in 1956 to 60, actually 58, the main things, but then changes when he read the proofs. Now, the 1960 book was explicitly designed to serve as the basis for a critique of the marginal theory of value and distribution. And he pointed out, and that is closely related, that the investigation is concerned exclusively. It's not quite correct, as we shall see, because there are counterfactual reasonings in his book, exclusively with properties of an economic system as do not depend on changes in the scale of production or in the proportions of factors. So the marginalist experiments of a little more capital, a little more consumption good of this sort, etc., they play no role. He derives his results without any reference to these marginalist concepts. And that in itself, I think, is an achievement which is not clear at all to marginalist authors, that it is possible, and indeed it was doubted and disputed. His analysis, then he went on, is based on the standpoint of the old classical economists from Adam Smith to Ricardo, which has been submerged and forgotten since the advent of the marginal method. So the book now really counterposes a marginalist approach on the one hand and a classical approach on the other hand, something that was not clear to him at the beginning of his investigation. Now, he clarified the marginal approach requires attention to be focused on change For without change, either in the scale of an industry or in the proportions of the factors of production, there can be neither marginal product nor marginal cost. And indeed, these are counterfactual reasonings. You see, what would be the case if a little more capital, a little more labor, a little less consumption, etc., etc.? What can we possibly know about this? Now, is the study of Sraffa's papers an exercise in morbid antiquarianism? It is obvious the way I started. I don't think so. Um, it is a concern rather with economic problems for which I claim no fully satisfactory answers have yet been found. They are still on the table. Can it therefore be expected to widen our perspective and improve our understanding of them? At least mine, it did, I believe. And perhaps it also does yours. So I think the answer can be in the positive or in the negative. No, it's not antiquarianism. So, Zenon Sraffa, more specifically, because Neri and I had discussions with Sen at the time when he was still a master of Trinity College. Now, Sen had the enormous advantage, of course, that he knew Sraffa for a long period of time and had numerous discussions with him. So he knew firsthand Sraffa's thinking, and he was also allowed to read the proofs of production of commodities in Sraffa's study. Only a few selected people were allowed to do that. John Robinson was not. I did not say anything. Yeah. And there are reasons why he selected Sen and others. At any rate, Sen was familiar with Sraffa's work and talked to him about it, but he did not know the archive. So he had a comparative advantage to us, an absolute advantage to us as regards personal contacts, but a disadvantage as regards the archive. He was master of Trinity College, but these masters have so many things to do, they cannot go to the library and read 30,000 unpublished pages of Sraffa's literary heritage. We poor people, we can. We actually have to. And we did. Which is not the same thing as understanding everything, to be clear. In Sraffa's case, these are two different things. Now, then went on that Sraffa had a philosophical suspicion of the invoking of counterfactual magnitudes and factual descriptions, and did find that the use of them involved difficulties that purely observational propositions did not. Since counterfactual reasoning, he went on, is an integral part of marginalism, how could Sraffa's book, which does not deal with counterfactuals, possibly be the basis of a critique of marginalism? So this is, he more insinuates it, I would say, rather than expresses it very strongly. But that is the question he asks, and I think it's a question that is, of course, legitimate, and the question is, can we answer it? Now, he also went on to argue that Sraffa did not intend to provide a causal system rival to the neoclassical one. He instead to have wished to change the nature of the inquiry. Now, I think his view that Sraffa was not critical of mainstream economics, I think, cannot be sustained, as we will show in a minute, and as, of course, Sraffa himself in his book expressed quite explicitly. So you see the things here. And what is more interesting, perhaps, today is that Sraffa, towards the end of his preface of the book, wrote, the critique of neoclassical theory may be provided by younger people and better equipped than me. But interestingly enough, he was working on a second book. He collected arguments, and some of these arguments were, of course, used by him in discussing with Pasinetti and Garignani, who contributed to this famous symposium on capital theory in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1966, yes. And it is interesting to see that some of the important arguments you encounter there in terms of a critique or an anti-critique to the critique of the neoclassicals who wanted to show that reswitching and all that is not possible, And Sraffa was very clear that in his view, switching is not that important. Important is capital reversing, reverse capital deepening. And he even gave a diagram and an example where you could see that on the outer frontier of all the WR relationships, there is no reswitching at all, but there is capital reversing one after the other. So capital reversing is really what matters. And some people, I think, misunderstood that he thought that reswitching is really the important thing. That is a footnote, which I think is important. And Sraffa already at an early time formulated this and then told Pasinetti for his article to bring it. And well, that's enough. Now, but in Sraffa, of course, there is counterfactual reasoning. Just to remind you, choice of technique requires some counterfactual reasoning. Joint production requires it because you need the requirements for use, as Sraffa called them, or demand in a non-neoclassical way in order to determine relative prices and income distribution. Renewable and exhaustible resources for sure. So, I mean, he is very well aware of that and he uses it, if you look at the book. Now, on the theoretical domains of theory of value in classical political economy, when Sraffa started to study economics deeply, of course he did it from the beginning onwards, but then in Cambridge, he came across the interesting fact that the concept of cost, as time went by, underwent serious changes. Serious changes, despite the fact that some of the interpreters, Marshall in particular, argued that what he did was just a continuation of what the classicals had done, but it was not. And the important concept Marshall used here was that of real cost. I mentioned that yesterday in the discussion. Real cost, but real cost in Marshall did not only mean the materials, the means of production, the means of sustenance of workers that had to be destroyed in the course of producing other things, right? In order to overcome the difficulty of production, as Ricardo put it, but also abstinence, disutility of work, etc., etc. Whereas in the classical authors, it was very clear their concept of costs was indeed material. What had to be destroyed in order to get some other materials? It was material, and of course the value of a commodity had to reflect those materials that were being used up. That was the main issue. Now, it is not clear how you aggregate these things. I mean, shoes of the workers and, I don't know, steel in production. How do you aggregate them? And therefore, the classical authors were very much concerned with asking for an ultimate measure of value or an ultimate source of value. That was the outcome of the fact that they had to deal with heterogeneous products, but didn't have the tool of simultaneous equations, where all the production lines could be displayed, prices then could be determined, solving the system of simultaneous equations under particular circumstances. This they didn't have. So, however, not distinguishing the different things here, disutility and iron or whatever, implied that the economic analysis of Marshall was bound to be defective. At that time, Sraffa did not yet, as already nearly pointed out yesterday, criticize Marshall's theory as wrong, totally wrong. But he argued that, well, I mean, maybe there is a place for it. We have certain problems which can be dealt with according to the classical economist's approach, and there are other problems which can be dealt with according to the Marshallian one. And indeed, he pointed out that to ask for the dominance or the exclusive correctness, validity of just one theory, this is 1928, if I remember correctly, implies big historiography. He does not use that word, but he writes, the absolute belief in the finality of present doctrines. the absolute belief in the finality of present doctrines. You see, this is what we have today. I mean, there are some people claiming, really, I mean, if you don't do that, I mean, you're just not an economist. Come on, get off the field. You get the red card, right? And Sraffa, at that early time, came up with that concept. Therefore, history of economic thought was a mere waste of scarce intellectual resources. Now, Sraffa argued, no, history of economic thought is the most important subject in a sense, because it tells you about, so to speak, the movement of the mind, how things are being regarded as time goes by, and how the exchange of ideas, etc., impacts on our beliefs. And you can be sure our beliefs will change as time goes by. So he was very clear that the history of economic thought is important in this regard, also because, of course, our mind is very much influenced by where we come from. I mean, the social background, right, etc., etc. I can't go into details. But he's of the argument that this ought to be taken into consideration. Now, economists, he argued, are legitimately using some theories for one purpose and other theories for another. You could say at the time he held the opinion of horses for courses, the famous English proverb, horses for courses. I mean, if I want to, it's clear. And he then rose the question, what determines at a given instant of time the price of foods, and not what determines the development? Then, of course, he would say physical real cost, as he later put it. That is materials. This is the most plausible explanation at the time. The leather, etc., etc. Whereas the inner feelings of the shoemaker, the Marshallian concept, who cares? No? Who cares? This does not count, I mean, in the end, as regards the price of the product. Unless it is a mass phenomenon and people rise and say, no, we don't want to have bad feelings, we want to have better feelings. So if you change the institutional setting, and that is, of course, a what-if question. If I want to enter into a new framework, can I be sure that what I want is realized, or is it the case that I jump from the, what is it, from the rain into the frying pan? Is that the proverb? Yeah, okay, let's assume it is. Good, okay. So what Sraffa suggested at that time was abductive logic, depending on the circumstances, right? Now, but there are problems with it, Marshallian theory, essentially. There are two different problems. One is the one of the classical economists, without counterfactual reasoning, the other one, Marshall. The classical economists had the problem of determining n-1 relative prices of n commodities at a given moment of time. That's how he described it at the time, right? Whereas the determination of the change of the n-1 relative prices is that what Marshall was interested. Now, the two problems, Sraffa insisted, have to be solved in different ways, and that of two opposite general theories of value, one might be true in respect of one question and the other in respect of the other. So he then attributed the former question to the theory of value, problem one to the theory of value, and the latter, interesting enough, to the theory of business cycles. So the price fixing stuff over time and changes of prices is an aspect of the theory of business cycles. So Marshall was basically in the second camp. Now, the first problem, he insisted, allows for the employment of the law of indifference. Now, the law of indifference, I think you are familiar with, means one price for a particular commodity, not many, no price size dispersion. A uniform rate of profit in competitive conditions, a uniform wage rate for a given type of labor, and so on and so forth. So that is what then he himself employed, as we know. Whereas this is not the case with regard to the Marshallian theory, business cycles where all kinds of things happen and change, then what about returns? Does he have to discuss them in one part of the theory or with regard to one problem or not? What about time? Does time come in and make a difference? Now, he conceptualized these things, thought about them, and he came up with the idea as regards the Marshallian, the famous Marshallian the demand and supply scheme. He argued, well, look, I mean, what matters here is only that the price is AB, and if the demand curve is the 1DD1, it is totally irrelevant whether the supply curve is the SS1 curve or the S2, S3 curve. Does not make a difference, right? The intersection point matters, at least for the determination of the price at a particular moment of time, right? So Marshall's concern with the shape of the supply curve is irrelevant. Yeah. Could be this or could be that, or it could be anything else. And he also distinguished between what he called a geometrical theory versus a mechanical one. Mechanical one is the Marshallian, and the geometrical is the one he was looking after. And he also pointed out that the first problem can be dealt with according to the idea of a photograph of the economy as a whole. Now, this is a tricky thing, I must say. We have written a paper on it because you can run into all sorts of problems and misinterpreting Sraffa. He pointed out that a photograph need not be timeless. Depending on how and when you trigger the you know, and whether there's a movement. So a photograph as such allows for also incorporating to a little extent time, and therefore his argument is not referring to a timeless economy. But you see, he was on the way. He was on the lookout for a convenient problem. And then the question was, in theory, as regards classical economics now, the first problem, right? Determining the n-1 prices, blah, 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 at a given moment of time or in a given period, because production takes time. He was very well aware of that. And he asked himself, which magnitudes can possibly be taken as given? Of course, they change as time goes by, but can be taken as given for the system I'm investigating. And he pointed out that quantities that cannot possibly be measured should not be taken as given, because what do I give? So it means that marginal utility and sacrifice cannot be taken as given. That is not a determinant of the system under consideration. And if you think that these are forces that are really relevant for that system, he would say, I mean, sorry, you're wrong. At the opposite extreme, there are quantities which can be statistically measured. These have an objective, independent existence. They can be measured physically with the ordinary instruments for measuring number, weight, time, etc. These are the only quantities which must enter as constants in economic theory, that is, which can be assumed to be known or given. And this is also, I mean, I think one of the passages which induced Neri and me to speak of Sraffa's objectivism. So, I mean, things that can really be measured. Now, of course, the formulation you could already say, number, weight, time. This is reminiscent of what Petty wrote in his book in 1694, I think it was, in which he pointed out that I am concerned only with such magnitudes. He wanted to provide, so to speak, an objective foundation of economics. I do not, he added, and I should give you the proper quote, I do not enter into a discussion of the mutable minds of people, their preferences, if you wish. Their, I mean, swiftly moving wants and wishes. So this may be done by others. And I think Sraffa had a similar view. I mean, these things do exist. But for me here, no, this is not what I'm concerned with. And therefore, as regards the third type of quantities, namely parameters of demand and supply curves, he wrote, no, these are not to be accepted as givens in the theory. I think the classical said, or I am reviving, the several quantities represented by these curves do not exist at any moment of time, nor during any period of the recurrent steady process of production or consumption. They are alternatives, only one of which can exist in any one position of equilibrium. Only one can exist. The others are, so to speak, fanciful. You imagine them. All the others being thereby excluded. Even the one does not really exist if there is no change. That is interesting. Therefore, they cannot be found by merely observing the process or state of things and measuring the quantities seen. They can only be found by means of experiments. And these quantities, in effect, are always defined in terms of such experiments. Successive doses applied to land, alternatives offered to the consumer, etc. So the economic theorist is now an experimenter who has to do a lot of speculative work because he is continuously imagining non-existing states of affairs and ought to be fairly sure about what they look like. And he continues, these experiments cannot be carried out and never have been, as a matter of fact, for various reasons. First, the practical difficulties, but secondly, the lack of definition of the conditions to be required, which are always summed up in the absurd other things being equal premise. So that is the criticism of the marginal theory here that works with this premise and is bound to work with this premise. These experiments are generally regarded as acceptable. Sorry, I have to give you the full content of those quotations because otherwise you would not understand it. If I summarized it, it would be worse in terms of content and perhaps even completely not understandable. So these experiments are generally regarded as acceptable as if they were calculated to reproduce under controlled conditions facts which actually happen in nature all the time. But the experiments have an entirely different significance. They actually produce facts. You see, it's not, they do not describe existing facts. They produce facts, according to Sraffa, which would otherwise not happen at all if the experimenter did not step in first to produce them and then to ascertain them. They would remain in the state of unknown possibilities. Unknown possibilities, which amounts to the deepest in existence. So, 20 minutes, yes. Yes. You're a good chairman. Because you're very kind to me. Thank you. Sraffa stresses what he calls the fantastic character of supply and demand curves. They are figments of our minds, of course. Yeah? And they require counterfactual reasoning. So conclusion, the mistake is to assume direct knowledge of these inexistent consequences. That is his criticism at that time. Now, on the role of counterfactuals in the theory of value, he argued the kind of approach the marginalists developed necessitated as an integral part of the theory to entertain counterfactual reasoning. Could not be otherwise. That is, you must have, indeed, and Marshall must have, supply and demand functions to get the price determined. And you must also determine, according to Marshall, in a partial equilibrium setting, the slope of the market supply curve by means of specific assumptions about variable returns. So here they come back, and the question is how to deal with them. Now, in both regards, counterfactual reasoning is indispensable. And Sraffa was critical of it. I think we have already basically covered the main argument. You see, whether you need a supply function if you have the price, or whether other supply functions could serve the same purpose. To say, did I do it? What if the light goes out? Then people start to think by themselves. This is not a bad thing in itself. In itself. Oh, now even that goes away. Maybe the building will soon disappear into the. Okay. Fun? Okay, okay. Mr. Chairman, this is not my fault. Slides are here. Oh, I see, but of course it's not. Criticism is that forces and insist that they're decisive. Of course, is a date. Now, I think it's difficult to think. Marshall's answers to the what are implicitly based, Rafa, on the assumption that here of oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. The course of the initial change in the given magnitude that activates market forces and triggers price dynamics. That is the argument he attributes to. No, really? Oh yes. Okay. But Sraffa argues not caring about what caused the initial change, it's bound to lead to defective economic analysis. So let us Sraffa insists that for his system of production equations, knowing the slope of the market supply curve is irrelevant. We have had that. Postulating the existence of market forces triggered by an exogenous change in one of the givens is therefore redundant. And no counterfactual of the kind have had things been different in this case. Now, Marshall wrongly assumes that the construction of supply functions for is unconditional. And this Sraffa demonstrates in terms of a simple counterexample. A simple example. Yes. So you see, this is now the general equilibrium approach, right? Oh, the microphone, yes. There are so many, yes, multitasking, multitasking, sorry. Now, he constructs a counterexample, which is, however, general equilibrium, if you wish, of a very rudimentary way. He assumes there exist two sectors, agriculture and manufacturing. Agriculture is subdivided in two branches. I think it was, what was it? Potatoes and wine. And in agriculture, of course, you need as factors of production labor, capital, and land. And all these factors are movable, can be moved within the sector between the two branches. I mean, you can extend land to produce wine and reduce potatoes, etc., etc. And then there is manufacturing. There is no land of a significant amount to be used, only capital and labor. And of course, capital and labor is also capable of moving within that sector, but also, as well as the agricultural one, between the sectors. Land not. So in agriculture, you have a limiting factor, land, and therefore you have diminishing returns. In manufacturing, on the other hand, you have increasing returns to scale. Now, not taking into account the conditions in which a change occurs is triggered by some change of some of the fundamental data, according to the marginalists, implies that you arrive at wrong ideas. Now, assume that preferences of agents change. They want more potatoes and less wine. Now, clearly enough, with regard to each of these production lines, there would be diminishing returns if the amount of land was limited. Now, if on the other hand, as it is assumed here, you reduce the amount of, what was it, potatoes? No, these guys wanted more wine. This was the Italian fraction. They wanted more wine, so less potatoes. You see, I mean, therefore nothing happens. For the sector as a whole, you do not change average cost on the assumption that, of course, the production theoretic conditions are the same, essentially. Capital intensity is what not there. But it's only an argument that gives you the flavor of the thing. So Marshall would have said the commodity which is more in demand in conditions of diminishing returns would rise in price. The supply function would be upward sloping. And Sraffa says, no, look here. It depends on where, so to speak, where you start and what are the compensating effects. Marshall assumed full employment. That's the neoclassical argument. It's long period argumentation, right? So no, you have a supply function which is horizontal, which is not rising. Now think about the other sector, the industrial sector. You would like to have more bicycles and less guns. And this is the sector where you have increasing returns to scale, but the same thing is to be applied here. You see, you reduce the amount of guns produced and you increase the amount of bicycles, but there's a shift of factors of labor and capital from one branch to the other one. Nothing happens. The average conditions, so to speak, do not change. So you would have even in this case, where Marshall would say the supply function would be downward sloping, it's a parallel to the abscissa. Counterfactual argument without, I mean, taking into account compensating effects in the system as a whole leads to erroneous arguments. And finally, of course, if you have a change in, say, demand for wine, but compensated by a change in the manufacturing sector, more demand for wine implies, of course, that the price would have to go up, but at the same time, if you reduce the amount of guns produced, there you go into diminishing returns now, because the quantity produced is lower, and therefore the relative price of the two need not change. So the question of the numeraire, for example, the standard of value, how do you measure your costs and your functions? So what Sraffa argues here is, in the three cases just mentioned, while in cases 1 and 2, no net flows of labor and capital between the two sectors take place. This is not so in case 3, but in each and every case, you get close to constant, supply functions, right? So, and they are very different cases. So what does that theory tell you? For what can it be used? Cannot be used for anything. And this is the reason, I think. This is the example which perhaps is the nail in the coffin of Marshall's theory. You cannot apply it unless you take into account the compensating effects. But then you get a situation which may be a big surprise. So I have only 15 minutes left, I think. So we have had that. Entirely different results will take place if the increase in the demand for bicycle is due to a smaller demand of guns or of wine. So you see, Sraffa demolishes the Marshallian partial equilibrium argument by simply pointing out, you see, you live in a world in which all kinds of things have to change. You cannot just say, we look at this and all the rest remains constant, the surgical airstrikes, no? Okay, I will close shortly, but you can read it. I think you can distribute, if you wish, those files, and there's the paper which has been sent, so you can read the paper as well. So let me just hurry on. The usual unconditional answer to the what-if question given by partial equilibrium analysis turns out to be defective in all cases we just saw, in which complex interdependencies cannot be ignored. And if you take them into account, then Marshall is gone. So give it up, forget it. Sraffa's argument clarifies implicitly which conditions must be met in order for partial equilibrium reasoning to lead to correct answers to the what-if questions, etc. Now, the problem of capital. In 1928, if I remember correctly, Sraffa was in close contact with Wittgenstein all the time. They were discussing on a regular basis after Wittgenstein had come back. It was in 29, I think. So maybe this is of 1930, but it's in the paper. You can find it. Sraffa wrote a little note entitled, "If I Were the King." And then he argued, well, if I were the king, this is a counterfactual. What would be? And he argued, well, either I would have been a totally different person, or what a king represents would have been totally different. Since it is enough that one of them is not true, it does not make sense, this kind of counterfactual reasoning. To contemplate, I would be a king does not make any sense. He adds, if I were a lecturer, makes sense because last year I was. So I still know what that means, what a lecturer is, what the lecturer has to do, etc., etc. So he argued counterfactual reasoning has to do with the proximity of situations. Are they close or are they not close? If they're not close, it's very difficult. Of course, you can say things. You can say, well, as a king, I would be, but nobody would believe you anyway. So the question of proximity, is the difference small or big? And if you apply this argument now to marginalism with infinitesimal changes, ceteris paribus, of capital or labor, you might at first sight say, yes, these changes contemplated are small, therefore that is perfectly reasonable to do so, right? You can do it, marginalism has no problem, but this is more apparent than real, because if you change the amount of capital, what is it? Is it of the same quality as the capital already in existence? Or is it different? And if it is different, if you have also different kinds of capital goods representing the same quantity, but how do you measure the... So, you argue in terms of a variable that is not well defined. And of course, if you really want to execute this, then you do not have a single factor that causes the change, but the entire system had to change in order to get to the new situation. So Sraffa argued In order to have a marginal theory of distribution, we must have a physical, in 1929, physical measure of the quantity of each factor independent of its share in distribution, independent of income distribution. It must not depend on the rate of profits in particular, right? This physical measure implies that each factor is perfectly homogeneous with itself, that is, all its composing particles are identical to one another. However, the addition of a dose may involve a radical change in the way in which all the preceding doses are used. The entire system may be, so to speak, revolutionized if it goes really badly. Depends, of course. Some capital goods are no longer used, others are used, so you'd have qualitative change apart from quantitative change, right? So this is his criticism. Now the concluding remark is thank you, or not you, but this guy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Whoa. I always struggle with this. People can hear me now. I can hear the weird echo. Our discussant, right there. Yes, please, please. Over to you. This is Michael Tedesco.
Hi. Thank you, Professor, for the great presentation. Hi, everybody. For those who weren't here yesterday, my name is Mike Tedesco. I'm a third-year PhD student here at the Econ program, and I have the privilege of being the student discussant for the seminar. So I'll ask a couple of questions to get the discussion rolling, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. So my first question is, so much of Sraffa's project is a rediscovery and reconstruction of classical economic thinking. Is his methodology, his methodological aversion to counterfactual reasoning another instance of this concern with reviving the classical approach, or is it a uniquely Sraffian contribution? Do we see Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and you mentioned Hume in your presentation, displaying a Sraffian caution or a Marshallian recklessness with respect to ceteris paribus assumptions? So if you could just speak to the relation between them and Sraffa on this question would be great. And my second question, some of the issues raised in your paper seem to have massive implications for the study of economics using statistical methods. In fact, you quote the important quote in your presentation, simple analysis of singular causation in terms of counterfactuals could arguably be the tagline for the discipline of econometrics. Did Sraffa, to your knowledge, ever weigh in on debates of methods of statistical inference, such as those between Keynes and Tinbergen, which you must have been aware of? And if not, can we extrapolate from his comments on counterfactuals a Sraffian approach to economics and statistics? And that's it.
Thank you much indeed for your questions. As regards the first question, Sraffa's project of, as he put it, rediscovery and reconstruction of classical economic thinking was not uniquely Sraffian. I think that kind of problem was on the table since a long time. In particular, I mentioned Hume, and Hume also pointed out that very often people mix up the results of such a change and the cause of the change. I mean, he discusses the issue of, in particular, monetary theory. What is the cause of, for example, high prices? And very often you confound, so to speak, the results with the sources. So it's not easy. Put perhaps in a more interesting way, I mean, now there's obviously we all, or some people talk about, of course, economic policy that is centered on what is it? Facts. No, the term is a different one. What? Evidence-based. Yes, that's it. Evidence-based. How could I forget that? Evidence-based facts. Yes, I mean, that is an old hat. The question is, what is the evidence? What are the facts I look at? And what are the results I derive? I mean, of course, that leads immediately to someone like Hume said that, but also Schumpeter. The sea of facts is infinite. The sea is infinite, and what is worse, it's silent. So in order to make it speak, you must have some idea of theory. You cannot do otherwise. So even what the facts are is not something that can be decided independently of the theory. And as a matter of fact, you might find out using your techniques then that it's not very satisfying. So you will then maybe change your theory and the evidence you need in order to give it life, empirical life. So I think many of our friends in the econometric and so on departments want to live easy lives, but as Paul Samuelson rightly pointed out, I mean, we economists were not born to live an easy life. So now I think it's much more complicated. I mean, Hume actually, the main problem is reconciling reason to experience. Reconciling reason to experience, and that is not a one-way avenue. It's a two-way avenue, right? So that is the first thing. I mean, Sraffa was not unique in this regard, but just belonged to the whole bunch. Now, counterfactual reasoning, if I may just add that, that was something that many major economists, which whom Sraffa held in high esteem, did all the time. Think about Adam Smith, the very concept of the natural course of events in Smith, so to speak, the good way to civilization, as opposed to the way which the mercantilists were responsible for spoiling all kinds of things. That is counterfactual reasoning. It's already counterfactual reasoning with regard to the natural course of events, because we are in a world in which things are not like that. So what is it? And of course, once you are there, then so or Marx. I mean, come on, Marx. I mean, the entire idea eventually to end up in a system in which everything is fine and glorious. That is counterfactual reasoning to the highest. And many of the other authors came up with that. Sure. So that is something very, very known since the beginning. It was always understood as a problem, as a difficulty, which does not mean that we do not have to do it. On the contrary, if you're interested in a better world, you might perhaps think about what that better world would look like, and if you want to install it, what are the preconditions for that? So now the second question you asked was, Keynes, yes, the economic. No, I mean, the interesting thing is statistical engagements of Sraffa. In his early life, he did occasionally some such things with Keynes, but basically not. But it is interesting. I think he was, Neri, you correct me, he was a founding member of the Econometric Society. Now, it was not the... No, I wanted to say that. But he was a founding member of the Econometric Society at a time when they were basically concerned with input-output analysis and these kind of things. And Pasinetti, even, I mean, one of his books, which is multisectoral input-output stuff, is called, I think, Lezione di Econometria, no? Yeah. Yes. Yes. No. But Sraffa left the club soon because he felt they were on the wrong track. So.
Thank you. With that, I'll open the floor to questions. I already have one hand up. I'll ask Kirsten to get us started.
Hi, thanks so much. Oh, it's really loud. So I just want my econometric students, my crazy lecture on the analytic philosophy of counterfactuals last week paid off, hopefully. So, but my question is about counterfactuals. And so for Lewis and for Hume, counterfactuals aren't just kind of floating out in the air. Counterfactuals are about a theory of causation. And what I didn't really hear a ton in your lecture is about that relationship between kind of a deterministic understanding of causes and how counterfactual thinking operates in that. And so I'd love to hear more about causes. As you know, like that's the whole reason Hume is doing counterfactuals, is because that's how he defines a cause. So I'd like to hear more about causes. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Heinz and Neri. Sorry I missed. Now I'm here in person finally. Sorry I missed yesterday. So I picked up on two themes in this talk. One of which didn't surprise me at all, and the other one has knocked me for six. The other one knocked me for six. Really surprised me. So the one that didn't surprise me was the idea that you know, we should be thinking in general equilibrium terms, small g, small e. That doesn't surprise me at all, because the Cambridge tradition, as I experienced it, was that unless you were thinking of a complex interrelated system as a whole, you weren't even starting in the right place. The nuisances were the people who turned up and lectured on the market for art or the Phillips curve, the sort of isolationists. So that theme makes perfect sense to me. What surprised me was that I heard you appeal to Sraffa as an abductive, invoking abductive reasoning. What must be true of reality if such and such is to hold? And what I also thought, but here I may be putting words into your mouth, is that for Sraffa, there is an absence of closure in reality and even a difficulty of creating conditions of closure. But by which time this sounds like proto-critical realism, and I'm almost expecting Tony Lawson to come in through the door and say, surprise. So I guess my question is following. Have I got this completely wrong somehow? Or is there a possible connection here to this critical realist tradition? If so, is this something that you've given any thought to? Because this took me by surprise.
Yes, the first question is about causes and of course causality, and that plays clearly a crucial role. I mean, Sraffa was critical of the kind of forces Marshall thought were the forces that dominated the economic system, namely, on the one hand, clearly enough, of course, production relations, but on the other hand, utilities, etc., individualistic concepts. Now, Sraffa, in his papers, he didn't need it for his argument as regards the equations, the production equations, but in his papers, otherwise, it is very clear that he felt that, I mean, there is such a thing as a class mind, and that people who belong to the same strata of society have very similar ideas and views and preferences and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it is not an individualistic concept that ought to play the dominant role in the entire argument. But you see, in the theories, as regards the analytical part, not a problem. And of course, also as regards production relations, I mean, you could say, but this is now an interpretation, but there are hints here and there. Sraffa's distinction between basic and non-basic commodities. You are familiar with it, I suppose. And non-basic commodities of various kinds can also be translated into power structures. I mean, if you are the proprietor of an industry that produces a basic, that is different from someone who has the property of an industry that produces hula hoop rings, if you know what I mean. You know hula hoop rings? Some don't. I mean, could you kindly make a little performance to? No, no. What I mean is, you see, you have the triangularization of the matrix. If you translate it into power structures, I think you can easily come from Sraffa's scheme to such a conceptualization. I mean, I'm not saying that Sraffa thought precisely that way, but it is obvious some sectors are more important than others for particular circumstances. If you destroy the energy producing sector in an economic system, particularly if it's becoming wind, that has strong implications. So I would say courses, yes, but discuss them according to circumstances, and circumstances change. Now, Mark, the first remark you made that in Cambridge, general equilibrium thinking was, so to speak, the ordinary fare. No. There were some people who did that, but Keynes, for example, had enormous difficulties to ward off Hayek's criticism of his monetary theory, because that criticism was based on three pillars: Paretian general equilibrium theory, Böhm-Bawerkian capital theory, and finally Misesian monetary theory. And Keynes knew nothing of them. He was not that well read, so he went to Sraffa and said, please help me out of the misery. And then Sraffa wrote this criticism, because he knew Pareto, he knew Böhm-Bawerk, and he even knew Mises. So, I mean, I think some people, yes, had a general equilibrium perspective on matters, but Keynes should have had, and had in his own way, but he was not familiar with the dominant literature in this area at the time, right? And the second thing is, yes, the case of abductive reasoning and absence of closure. Well, I think critical realism. I must tell you, I never understood what that is. So I'm not the one to answer your question. I typically try to talk only about things I believe to have understood. I like Tony, of course, wonderful, but I never understood. This is, well, I suppose there are many people here who are critical realists of that kind. Yes, but look, please forgive me, but you might, of course, convince me if you have a good argument. So I don't know this, but Sraffa was very clear. You see, this analytical approach he had was, of course, you could say, to use a Schumpeterian term, culturally and socially underdetermined. He had a grand scheme which could then be utilized for various purposes, reflecting particular historical, social, and whatnot circumstances. And I think a theory ought to be, versatile in this regard. And I think if Sraffa had produced a theory for a very narrow social, historical entity, it would be much less interesting. But I think you can apply many of his arguments to wide circumstances. And therefore, I think he was not reluctant to discuss these matters. As a matter of fact, I mean, if you look at his books, his library, and his writings, he was very well read in anthropology, in ethnology. He studied, for example, the question of whether it is true, as Engels and even Adam Smith maintained, that in the early and rude state of society, the labor theory of value holds straight away. And he found out that this is not the case, because at that time they were interested in minimizing the use of materials. They were dear, people were cheap, right? So labor was not the important thing. So if you look at him, I mean, he could tell you wonderful stories, perhaps some backed up with his own theory, in order to understand this complicated world, which is beyond our perception and understanding in as regards certain deep levels.
Sanjay and Will.
Wonderful talk. Thank you. I have two questions. The first concerns contention that we must examine the question of values and costs and prices without considering change. But there are two ways to consider change. One as a continuous movement and one as the comparison of differences. And it would seem to me that many important questions must be considered in terms of a comparison of differences. And that does not necessarily involve dynamics. Think of, in particular, the difference between Fordism and Taylorism, where we might, which many economic historians consider quite important. In the case of Fordism, you are changing the structure of the technology. In the case of Taylorism, you are doing time and motion studies and examining the movements made by the agents who are doing the work and the ways that that can be speeded up. But this is very relevant to the question of the origin of the surplus. Both of these are ways of increasing the surplus, and it may be very useful to distinguish them. Okay, first question. That's the first question. The second question is, is subjectivity. It seems to me that everything that Sraffa has said, I would not only agree with, but applaud. Yet, there is an area in which subjectivity is really important, and it concerns valuation. And that is the exercise of economic power, where we can consider this as the imposition of costs. You try that, we're going to sue you. The imposition of costs by one party on another. We are going on strike. You're not going to be able to have anything to sell for the next couple of months. This is an imposition of costs, but how do we know, unless we examine subjectively, what the effect of that is going to be? The imposition of costs on certain agents in certain conditions may be much different than the imposition of the same kind of costs on similar agents, but who are in different conditions or who have a different makeup. That's the second.
Well, I think pointing out that Sraffa was concerned with regard to the determination of prices at a given moment of time, not with change, does not contradict what you just said. I mean, he was perfectly aware of the fact that we do not have a dynamical theory that would allow us to, so to speak, write the future history in all its details from now to eternity. We do not have, say, Oded Galor theory of economic growth, which from the past to modernity tells you what has happened in terms of some simple mechanisms and explanatory devices, uh, that is obvious. But of course, he was aware of the fact that the classical economists tried to understand the dynamics of the system in terms of, today we would call them long period positions, a succession of long period positions, centers of gravity that would make themselves felt according to circumstances, including, of course, the main driving forces of the system, technological change. I mean, Smith was perhaps not the best character in this regard because, at least according to my interpretation, and he was not completely consistent, I think. I mean, he was writing about improvements. And in the tradition of Hume, he was of the opinion that much of the improvements technologically and organizationally are essentially due to the opening of an economic system to the international world and therefore having access to the technological frontier worldwide. So, I mean, he says that in some respects quite explicitly. That was Hume. I mean, the modern world is one which is going towards the technological frontier, but this is improving only, but not innovating in a very fundamental sense. So I think the law of the falling rate of profit in Smith, as I understand it, has a lot to do, so to speak, with the fact that technological progress as a force that can improve profitability is petering out. But I may be wrong in this. But at any rate, I mean, of course, their issue was a system continuously in motion. But how to deal with it? How to deal with it vis-a-vis the fact that you had continuous qualitative change. I mean, you couldn't present this in a one commodity world. Today you get a Nobel Prize for such a thing, it seems. I mean, of course, I mean, I do not want to belittle, I mean, the achievements of certain colleagues, but this was a major problem to these authors. The universe of commodities, of skills, of tasks, etc., was expanding all the time. How to deal with the growing heterogeneity. That was quite difficult. So, and also the kind of technological changes later on, they played an important role. I mean, your example of Fordism, Taylorism, yes, but again, they would discuss it in terms of systems that were fully, so to speak, adjusted to the new. I mean, when Ricardo discusses, interestingly enough, I've mentioned it earlier on, when Ricardo discusses the case in 1923 or 21, I think it was, the case of a fully automated system. A fully automated, so to speak, thinking to the end of the development that had just been started. The labor theory value was completely gone. There is no labor anymore that is of any interest. And so, but he thought it out and he said, well, in this case, we have a particularly pronounced distribution problem. What will those who are not capitalists do? What will they live from? So, no, I fully agree, but Sraffa, in his papers, discussed some of these matters time and again. He had a much larger research project originally, but given the difficulties of even getting his equations solved and understood, was enough for one single man, and he was one of the greatest scholars I'm aware of. So yes, so that is this thing, and of course transformational growth. You do this. You do this. Why should Sraffa do it? I mean, you do it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take one.
Subjectivity. Just a second. Subjectivity. Yes. Well, in Sraffa you find such discussions, but they do not take a lot of space. There are remarks here and there, and very often they're very deep. It is not for nothing that Amartya Sen told the audience that Sraffa was the one who told him most about the behavior of people and the motivations. But he did not write about that. I mean, I think you know the passage. former student of Amartya's. You know the passage I'm referring to. So, I mean, he was very quiet on certain issues, despite the fact that he knew perhaps more than many others about it.
I'll take one last round of questions, including a question online, and then we'll finish with an extended answer to them. Okay. So I have Sanjay, followed by.
Thank you very much. So as you mentioned, I am a student of Amartya Sen, and I don't want to claim the authority that you said Sen has vis-a-vis Sraffa as a result of having been around him, let alone absolute advantage or comparative advantage. But let me say that I have heard him say many times that Sraffa's project in production of commodities by means of commodities was to demonstrate that it would be possible to undertake a form of economic reasoning that did not involve counterfactuals. But that's not the same thing as saying that all forms of economic reasoning that are worth doing do not avoid counterfactuals, nor is it the same thing as saying that one can go about life or economic policy or anything else without counterfactuals. And I don't think that Amartya Sen has ever suggested that Sraffa was making those larger claims. So I don't think so. So insofar as my reading is that he wasn't making those larger claims. He was making a very particular claim about the nature of Sraffa's project in the book to demonstrate the possibility of undertaking a particular kind of economic reasoning, by which I take to mean the demonstration that it's possible to arrive at determinate conclusions simply from the data or the information contained in the snapshot, so to speak, the photograph which you described, which contains particular economic data, factual economic data. I don't think that Sen's perspective is shown to be wrong, as I think you demonstrated, or you suggested that you would demonstrate in one of your early slides. So I would just like to urge you to perhaps make a more modest approach to what Sen's claims are here, and also to the understanding of what is the role of counterfactuals and what isn't the role of counterfactuals in Sraffa's framework. Perhaps there's a boundary line that can be drawn there. Merely a thought.
Yeah, hi, Heinz. It's so great to have you back at the New School. It's great to see you. And I actually wanted to ask quickly about Kurz rather than about Sraffa, because I know when you were visiting the New School, you had either just produced or were about to produce this book on effective demand from a Sraffian perspective. And you didn't mention in the talk any considerations of effective demand in Sraffa's archives and his treatment of counterfactual. But it seems that the Keynesian tradition maybe spurred an enormous interest in counterfactual analysis, whether, I don't know which exact interpretation of Keynesianism might have been responsible for that. But you are the expert who has kind of worked to reconcile those two lines of inquiry. And I just wonder if you could comment kind of from your perspective, whether they're reconcilable, given kind of, I hadn't thought about it in terms of the insistence or openness to counterfactuals, but whether or not that's feasible, thinking about your own contributions in this regard.
Can I actually abuse my role here? I'm the one to transfer the online question, which is a very simple one. How should we distinguish Leontief's input-output analysis from Sraffa's production of commodities by means of commodities, which ties well with the econometric society here? But if I may abuse my role on the transfer, I want to follow up Sanjay's question. There is a completely different reconstruction of the classical school, both Ricardo and Marx, as a matter of fact, coming from Japan. And I'm talking about Morishima and Okishio. And if you look at that, it looks like counterfactuals are playing a very large role there, which is interesting to compare with Sraffa's proposed reconstruction.
And now it's my turn to abuse my position. I wanted to offer perhaps a transformation of coordinates in the discussion so that perhaps it is less about counterfactuals or not counterfactuals per se, but about what it is that theory is trying to promulgate. If my theoretical vision is inspired by the need to end up in a place where I can say that a market outcome at some characterization of equilibrium is somehow optimal, it is inherent in that pursuit that I need to consider the alternatives. I need to consider the counterfactuals. There is something in that kind of allocative problem that begets immediately the question of counterfactuals. Sraffa, and the more I learned with your help about him, the more convinced I am of just how Marxist he was also methodologically Marxist. That's a parenthesis, but he was interested in showing a number of things as I see it. One, that one can conceive of the system as one in which capital goods are not a fundamental scarcity. They are in fact an output. Capital goods. They are an output. They are an outcome of the problem, of the system. Number one. Number two, that distribution is not a technical matter. That we can actually conceive of systems of prices where the technical interdependencies are influencing them, but fundamentally have this functional distribution, social conflict. Those are concerns that do not beget the kind of counterfactual thinking that an allocative, is that the word I'm looking for? Concern begets. And finally, on counterfactuals, everybody does counterfactuals. Marx did counterfactuals, even though he is also along the same lines as Sraffa, making statements about realizations very often, and nowhere more clearly is he doing this. And this led to no end of difficulties, as he is in chapters 13, 14, and 15 of the third volume, the infamous discussion on the law of the tendency, where he's actually working through the effects of a perturbation on the state of capital market, labor market, and technological equilibrium that characterizes the value system, and then is offering considerations. Okay, so now what happens? And he does end up, because not all counterfactual reasoning leads to trouble, in a pretty sensible set of considerations where he basically tells us, look, the outcome is going to depend on how this change percolates through the system into the value of consumption goods and investment goods. And you're going to have to work backwards from that. So that takes me then to the conclusion that perhaps an additional element of what Sraffa is reacting to here is the level of heroic specificity that we are required to entertain whenever we do Marshallian or Eurasian analysis concerning the details of the individual level situation. And I'm coming from Hayek here in this regard. And I'll stop there. I've spoken too much. Over to our I get excited about these things. I'm sorry. Well, quite. Not. Well, frenemies. Yes.
No, no. No, I would like to say something about Sen and the interpretation given before. I don't think is very convincing, because this will be another paper that we are preparing actually, but it is in a very rude state. And concern counterfactuals within production of commodities and means of commodities. There are several places, we counted at least 12, where there are explicit counterfactuals. So the interpretation given by Sen, not given by Sen, given by you about Sen, I don't think is convincing, because there are several counterfactuals. It is true that there is an attempt to avoid them, no doubt. But for Sraffa, a counterfactual is to be avoided when it can be avoided, but not always. And what is important, and I think can be in some sense the summary of the argument, is that when we use counterfactuals, we have to pay a lot of attention. That is the point. Because it is very simple to say, so if this is so, then, but if this is so, maybe very complicated. No, I remember someone in Italian newspaper said, it was some years ago, the fiat without Marchionne has a value. The fiat with the Marchionne has a different value. So that is the price of Marchionne. But you can see that to evaluate the fiat without Marchionne is almost impossible, and the fiat with Marchionne was possible at the time because there were share in the stock exchange. But apart from that, the point is that when we use counterfactuals, we are at risky. That is the point. That is the point. Does not mean that we cannot use and we have not to use them, but when we use, we have to pay attention and to consider what are the elements which allow us to say something sensitive using that counterfactual.
It's other things being equal that is the villain of the piece, not counterfactuals.
I'll ask Professor Kurz to conclude the discussion. We have about 10 minutes.
After such a wonderful avalanche of most significant considerations about the problem I was concerned with, what can I do? Basically, I should have a white flag and show it to you. No, but just because as a professor, I have a high propensity to talk. Let me just spend the time talking. Now, Sanjeev, yes, Sen, I mean, we did not want to be unfair to him, not at all. We had discussions, long discussions with him. And some of his remarks in his articles over time, I mean, the contents change a little bit. And some indeed seem to insinuate, at any rate, that Sraffa did not use counterfactuals at all, and that is not true. As Neri pointed out, will be a topic of two other papers, actually, because you remember perhaps I mentioned 3 periods of Sraffa's work. We only talked about basically the first period. The second period in the 1940s has some new results, and they concern in particular also counterfactuals, because he talks about now issues which he avoided at the beginning and in the third period on top. But the important point in this regard is that Sraffa's argument was characterized by a remarkable continuity. They are not big jumps, I would say. He changed his position here and there a little bit. He sharpened it, but I think his main position remained the same. And the main position is, you see, I mean, if you want to determine distribution in terms of the marginal products of agents, and you introduce capital, what does that mean? Can't be. I mean, that is already, I think, a very strong criticism. You may have other arguments and then think about theories which do not run into such difficulties, but that was his argument. The counterfactual reasoning of the theory of income distribution as it is being told today is so much based on this concept that you must beat it. I mean, even if otherwise you see, maybe this is all very complicated and philosophy and this and that and whatnot. No, but that is a crucial aspect. If income distribution is not decided that way, then how is it? You see, I mean, we have work to do. I think that is the first thing I would like to say. Now, Will's intervention, counterfactuals and effective demand, Leonte versus Sraffa. You're right, at the time I was a fairly young man. I mean, I did all kinds of things. But I think, yes, using a Sraffan approach in order to understand somewhat better, for example, the multiplier, makes sense. I'm very surprised that now, I mean, multipliers using multisectoral systems are en vogue again. I produced a paper in 1986, and yes, of course, you see all of a sudden things which you wouldn't see in a one good economy. Of course, there are lots of problems, and the main problem is what about fixed capital? I mean, many of these models have only circulating capital. What matters is the utilization of capital, and that is another thing which I think we did. I mean, the issue of the utilization of capital, that's a very important topic and very often underrated. I mean, in some of the macro models, you just have a degree of utilization for the system as a whole, but you have different capital goods. So you ought to take into account that some capital goods under certain circumstances cannot be used, whereas under others they can. Sraffa, in a short paragraph, pointed out obsolete machines can be utilized in certain circumstances. So effective demand even plays a role in Sraffa. Not a very pronounced one, but you see, this guy so often produces just a sentence waiting for his students to to start painting the canvas. No, like a Renaissance painter. I mean, who said, "Well, I mean, now do it." And, it's up to you. I mean, Sraffa is there, and unfortunately, he's dead. But I mean, it's Leontiev. Leontiev, you see, Leontiev is a particular case because he knew, of course, Sraffa's book, and he himself started with input-output analysis somewhat earlier, of course, in a two-sectoral system, and there was a debate with Remak and all that. But it is interesting, Leontiev in 1985 or 6 it was, he published an article in the Academic American or something like that, in which he used input-output data to construct, he was one of the first, not the first, one of the first WR relationships. And he then confronted those WR relationships over time and tried to explain how the system indeed developed vis-a-vis technological change that gave rise, in a Sraffian terminology, if you wish, or Garignanian, long period positions of the economy. So it is very interesting. He gave the talk at the New School. I was there, and afterwards I talked to him and said, well, that's interesting. That is also, I mean, Sraffa has similar ideas, it seems. And he turned around and went away. I was very surprised. So Sraffa and Leontiev, that is a case of non-communication, I'm afraid to say. Well, further, just Chairman, yes. I mean, if a situation is non-optimal, yes, then there is, of course, room for trying to get it there. Very often we do not know what optimal is. In a complex world, we do not know what optimal is. And the problem with counterfactuals is you might think, I should do this. And then you blow up the system. You see, there have been so many cases of very well motivated political activities also that ended up in misery, that again, careful and with a lot of circumspection. I think you must be able to discuss really with a long capability of seeing into the future, because many of the effects of a change in the situation do not show immediately. And you cannot even assess what, so to speak, the future will bring. You do not know. Did we know in the year 1776 that industrialization would eventually lead to climatic problems? And who knew it? There were effects. There were counterfactuals, if you wish, that were tried out. And so very careful. Our knowledge is so limited, not least because time plays such an important role, and some effects are cumulative and take a lot of time to be brought about. Now, was he methodologically a Marxist? I think, yes, I think he was. He was an objectivist, a Marxist, a materialist. Yes, very much. But he was on top of that a very clever man. And whenever he felt that something was wrong, even in Marx, sorry to say that, He would say that. I mean, he did not think that Marx was, so to speak, the high priest of a sect. He was an intellectual, and an intellectual has to accept that if he is wrong or she is wrong, even she's can be wrong occasionally, then, I mean, you have to correct it. I mean, learning implies that, of course, you must make even errors in order to be able to learn. So, yes, social conflicts, Sraffa played a very important role. I mean, yes, indeed. I mean, he was supporting Gramsci. He was in contact with Gramsci all the time. He went to the prison, gave him medicine, gave him books, etc. He was well aware of the situation then, and he was of the opinion that one should even strike a compromise with the bourgeoisie because, I mean, the fascists are still something different. And so, I mean, he was a political man to the extreme, and he was a great intellectual. So yes, the heroic specificity. Yes, I think you're right. I mean, or I would say now Hayek, the pretense of knowledge. The pretense of knowledge. I mean, Hayek, this paper I think is a good one. Some economists, not us, of course, clearly not. They pretend to know things which cannot possibly be known as yet. And they pretend to be, I mean, this entire issue, the quality of a theory should be decided in terms of its predictive powers, the Friedmanian thing. I mean, Samuelson was quite right. You predict then that your assumptions are correct. And you can base your argument on the most horrendous and stupid assumptions possible, right? So thank you very much indeed. I'm exhausted with